sit on sand, twice stick it, just remove the dice, ride with the moon in the dead of night.
Last night, I dreamt I went to Manderley again. Hello everyone, and welcome to day 14 of Terrorthon. Now, it's one of our main objectives in Terrorthon to construct a complete history of horror as an art form, and we've been doing a good job of that so far, but there are a lot of areas we've missed, such as today's subject, Gothic horror. We're all familiar with the term Gothic, but apart from seeing a bunch of people in black hoodies with lots of piercings and looking very strange, you're probably not fully aware of where that term comes from. So let's get into that right now. So long before horror became officially recognised as a genre, this was the equivalent back in the 1600s, 1700s, and we're going to explore it a little bit and how it led to modern horror. So what is Gothic horror exactly? Well, for a start, originally it wasn't known as Gothic horror, it was simply known as Gothic fiction. And these stories focus on a battle between humanity and the unnatural forces of evil, often within bleak, oppressive and inescapable landscapes. The stories are very metaphorical and tend to discuss morality, philosophy and religion often. They rarely have happy endings, and very often the past will intrude on the present in these stories. They're almost never romantic in nature. In fact, there's a subgenre called Gothic romance that would focus on that instead. And they often take place in Gothic architecture such as castles and mansions, very oppressive landscapes as previously mentioned. Early Gothic fiction was inspired by the works of William Shakespeare, the epic poem Paradise Lost, and the works of Alexander Pope as well. The first work to be officially called Gothic, and even by its own author, was called The Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole, released in 1764, and as I say, that was later subtitled A Gothic Story. The Gothic fiction genre reached its heights of popularity in the 1790s, and it was dominated by the author Anne Radcliffe. And as time went on, Gothic fiction would evolve into the Penny Dreadfuls by the Victorian era, which we've previously discussed. And another groundbreaking work in Gothic fiction was Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, released in 1818, wherein rather than the protagonists having to deal with a supernatural or man-made force, they were now contending with the physical embodiment of human folly. And then in the 1900s, that's when the Gothic fiction began to be called Gothic horror instead. And the author H.P. Lovecraft wrote a book called Supernatural Horror in Literature, which would set the standard for Gothic horror from that point onwards. And then his protege, Robert Bloch, wrote the book Psycho in 1959, and from that point, modern horror fiction was born. So there came a point where it wasn't Gothic horror anymore, it was just regular horror, it was recognised as its own genre. And the same thing happened in movies. In fact, in movies, Gothic horror is not an officially recognised film genre. If you look at some of the more famous examples of what you would call Gothic horror in a movie, that label simply isn't there. I guess film noir would probably be the closest equivalent. But regardless, here are some examples of some movies that are considered Gothic horror even still. So you got The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which came out in 1920, and that used German expressionism to transform the American approach to Gothic horror and horror in general. And then we had Nosferatu in 1922, one of the most important horror movies of all time. That's often considered Gothic horror, which makes total sense. And then in the golden age of horror in the 30s, we had Universal's Dracula and Universal's Frankenstein, who would further the genre even further. And then probably the seminal work, in my opinion, would be Rebecca, directed by Alfred Hitchcock and released in 1940, based on the novel by Daphne du Maurier. That's pure Gothica, in my opinion. And then probably the last, most important one would be Hammer's Dracula, which released in 1958. And from that point on, we had modern horror. We didn't need to call it Gothic horror anymore. It was just horror. It was very well recognised and a household name. And that is essentially the complete history of Gothic horror. You still do occasionally get some examples of movies that qualify as this, but for the most part, it's dead. However, it was one of the precursors to horror as we know it. In fact, if Gothic horror wasn't born, horror as we know it today probably would not exist. So we have a lot to thank it for. See you tomorrow.